Yeah, I do have them. Just give me a second. Yeah, I do.
Okay. I think we all have bios in our material, so I'm not going to give bios for all of these speakers. We can just, everyone here can read. I know a number of the people on my panel. There's a couple people I don't know. It's always interesting to talk about future content. It's kind of unknown, but we've had digital content for the networks now for, by my counting, about 30 years. And I remember when we didn't know what we were calling it and what was it, and we were trying to figure out who was doing it. Now we're looking at crowdsourcing. We're looking at virtual reality. We're looking at immersive. We're looking at a lot of new technologies, particularly that are coming online and being available for consumers probably this January. Greg will fill us in on more of that later. So I'm going to start. I'm going to ask my panelists to come up and speak in the order that they're listed here. So Terry, would you like to start this? Sure. Okay.
Want me to speak from the podium, or?
I think you can speak from there if
Right
you're
here?
comfortable,
Okay,
but you're
good.
welcome to come up here if you prefer.
I'm good.
Is that okay with you, Ellie? Do we have a camera on this that's a reason for people to have to come here? I'm sorry.
Okay, good.
What would you like, Jason? What would you like? It's okay? Okay.
Terrific. Hi, I'm Terry Denson, and I'm the Vice President of Content Strategy and Acquisition for Verizon, which means I'm responsible for content strategy and acquisition across all the Verizon content platforms, inclusive of Fios, broadband, mobile, and whatever, for so long as I'm there, whatever else the future may bring. I think in terms of some introductory remarks, I think I came to Verizon to launch a multi-channel video service in 2005. Got there in 2004, so I had plenty of time to do it. And it was based upon fiber to the home. There was much question as to whether fiber to the home was the right strategy, a necessary strategy. What benefit did it provide to consumers? Was there a way in which you might get that return? It was basically a $20 billion initiative, and my job was to make sure there was a content strategy that would return $20 billion and more for Verizon. It didn't take 10 years to get a return on that investment. We did it quicker. It didn't take 10 years to get confirmation that it was the right strategy. It probably took 3 or 4. Didn't take 10 years for fast followers in the competitive space. That probably took 4 or 5. So here we are today, and I can tell you that we're looking already at the next generation of multi-channel delivery, and fiber to the home is nearly passé. So where am I spending my time today? Certainly not in the past. It's in the future, and consistent with Ellie's remarks, we are focusing on what we believe, and I love this idea of, Ellie, you call it cultural acceleration, and it's an idea or notion that 10 years ago, from a content strategy and acquisition perspective, it was about finding the best content, the most relevant content, like Coleman's content at Turner, and then making sure that we were packaging it in a way that was compelling, multi-platform for consumers, because they wanted the content that they liked most and they wanted to have it everywhere, et cetera. And we've all heard that. But today, it's really about culture. So we've recently launched a new service, a mobile-centric service called Go90, and this is the next big bet that Verizon has in the video distribution space. It's premised upon not so much the aggregation of quality content, although you need to do that. It's based upon the cultural notion that amongst the generation that's highly coveted, the millennials and Gen Z, and also key influencers in society, and which is a little bit different than I think generations past, where you have a younger generation that actually influences the behavior of the older generations. In this case, think Gen X and the baby boomer generation, capturing a cultural notion that is really embedded in the idea that this is a group that has a passion, their most passionate relationship is probably with their cell phone. And even when they have passion relationships, they tend to actually do that. In the terms of bridges, so you had like a complex bridge for like server farm and all that kind of stuff, then there is like an emotional bridge for this group. It's actually through their phone. So they'll date through the phone, they'll do lots of things through the phone, and then sometimes they'll be in the same room and together, and they're all sort of doing this, and they actually may be communicating, 3 feet away from each other and communicating via text in a way in which you're actually free to articulate verbally. And so that's the passion. So that passion, we translated that into a cultural position, taking into consideration everything that we knew about where video consumption is today, what we've learned before, which is simply there are cat videos in the world, but cat videos actually don't really drive the content consumption in a sustainable way. It's content like Coleman will talk about at Turner and others, but you've got a new cultural norm in that the democratization of content, if I were saying this 3 years ago, people talked about user-generated videos, but the democratization of content is really blending what the content that Turner has done, and there's no real difference, or that the difference is a distinction between Turner's content and Awesomeness TV content or Maker content or Machinima content. That distinction is evaporating. So you take that content and realize that these consumers are agnostic, that their cultural aspiration is really driven through their handset, and we created a concept called Go 90 that will actually bring this content, and you have to make it social because that's part of the culture. So you take content, distinctions removed, you integrate it, you make it social, give it to them in the way that they want it, and then they will not only consume it, but they'll actually influence others to consume it. And then one more thing, that for years, the notion around content distribution and even content licensing is monetization. So in the monetization engine, most businesses like to have assurances. So having recurring monthly subscriptions is assured revenue. However, you're dealing with a generation who will find the free, share their passcodes, whatever, they're going to find the free. So we decided that we would just cut to the chase and create this cultural phenomenon that's aspirational, a service that's based upon cultural acceleration, and then make it free so that we would remove the barriers for entry. So that's, that in a nutshell, that's where we are. I think this is called the future of content or something like that. So we are trying to, that's sort of my view, our vision at Verizon as with respect to the future of content.
Thank you. Yep. Like, hold questions till the end. Okay. Breland, would you like to take over?
Sure, I'll
and
be
defend
glad to.
actual quality content here?
Quality content. First of all, has anybody really ever seen a cat video on YouTube? Yeah. Look at that. Okay, so there are cats on YouTube because that's what I always hear. And
Skateboarding cats.
skateboarding cats. Okay, that's good to know. And second, I once went to a Billy Joel concert in Greensboro, North Carolina, and it was a surprise concert, so it didn't get a lot of notice. And Billy Joel walks out and he says, he looked at it and he saw, like an open seat next to you and to you, and he said, look, when your friends hear about this concert, they're going to be really upset they missed it. So we're going to do our best up here to make you feel like you're at a Billy Joel concert, and your friends who didn't make it here today will really be sad. I'm Coleman Breland. I'm the president of Turner Content Distribution. Terry is very gracious with his comments, and in the industry, people call us Turner, but you may not know what all falls under the portfolio. So just to make sure you do know that, this goes all the way back to Ted Turner, the mercurial genius who really helped create what was known at that time as the cable industry, with the launch of TBS Superstation and CNN and HLN and Turner Classic Movies and TNT and TBS and Cartoon Network and Boomerang and CNN International and CNN Espanol. We have 10 primary brands that once upon a time were called linear networks, and now there's something radically different. My job is basically to work with Terry and others to get our content distributed on as many platforms and devices and in front of as many eyeballs as possible, which is really a fascinating job. And again, shout out to Terry, because Verizon is a phenomenal distributor of ours, and we really enjoy working with them. Couple of tent posts to think about and the way we consider content. This was so easy at one time because there were tremendous growth curves in the industry. So you would launch a network, distributors would carry it, they'd pay you. It was a very simple negotiation. I actually have a copy of the first CNN licensing agreement. It's a page and a quarter. You wrote down the name of your system, we wrote in a rate, and that was it. The contracts now, what are they, Terry? They're multi-dimensional. They're 100 pages. TV Everywhere contracts are sometimes 100 pages. These are highly negotiated because they have to do with rights and windows. And Terry said a fascinating word, which he talked about, agnostic. And so in a world where, yes, we are concerned that people become very agnostic about content, and do brands matter? Or is it just the creation? So we think a lot about, what does a brand mean? And so here are the tent posts. So if you look at the Turner portfolio across TV and mobile and digital, every month this year so far, we've averaged reaching about 76% of the adults 18 and older across all three platforms. So if we were still a cable TV company, we would be hurting, because mobile is critically important to us and digital is incredibly important. And then if you look at what we call Turner Digital, which is everything from CNN.com to the cartoon app to Turner Classic Movies app to we run properties with the NBA, and we have Bleacher Report and others. It's the number 3 media property in the third quarter, which averages, for that quarter, it was about 116 million uniques that consumed about 280 million hours of content. So we've been shifting for a long time, thinking about what does this business look like? And in a world of linear networks where they're 24/7, and there are people like you that sit there and schedule and say, hey, look, when Terry gets home, and Terry gets home late because he works very hard. So when Terry gets home at 9, we want him to turn on one of the networks and watch from 9, 10 to 11 and stay there. There are people who do that. But there are also people now who think about, how do I get components of that on YouTube? How do I get that what's my relationship with a Spotify or an Instagram or virtual reality? We can talk about that in CNN and what we did with the recent debates. All of that plays into how relevant can you stay to viewers. And here's one example. Cartoon Network is in third quarter again. Third quarter is #1 total day delivery for kids 6 to 11. So you think, well, everybody's consuming on that platform, correct? Well, actually, for July and August, it was also the #1 video on demand product and brand with about 94 million downloads. On a monthly basis, the app, the Cartoon Network app, gets about 23 million views, content viewed. And then you've got online, and so for a quarter, that's about 73 million. So what we find is, do brands matter? Do people really go? Because when you're in the content creation business, and by the way, this is hard. It's hard to find hits. It's hard to stay consistent with the hits because there's so much competition. To Terry's point, it's everywhere now. Pretty easy to start a news business. Let's walk out of here, and the 5 of us will create a news blog. And if we call it news, it's news, right? So it's sort of different. Anything and everything that happens on a screen competes with Turner Broadcasting. If you were spending time on iTunes, downloading music, you're tracking your buys on eBay, anything you can do with that screen absolutely competes with us. So we have to stay very versatile in the way we think about an immersive experience across every single demographic. I'll stop there.
Okay, so these are 2 big industries that we've had represented. Go ahead.
Well, I'm gonna use my PowerPoint, if I may. Let's see here. I can find it. It's pre-installed. Was it pre-installed? It should be. I'm not sure where to find it though.
Jason?
Is Jason still here? maybe it's
Just a second, go to.
maybe it's visible someplace.
It's a desktop.
I'm gonna send it to him. Here it comes. Jason, would I find my PowerPoint on here? It's on the hard drive. So give you something to look at other than me for the next few minutes.
Turn our seats if you want to see this for any reason.
I thought I'd just,
Yeah, just look in the back of your head.
actually, I'll get a mirror. I'm sure there's a mirror on my camera. I can just,
That will reverse the.
can reverse the image for you.
Exactly.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you, Ellie. And I'm going to pick up on a theme that you introduced as well, and suggest that we're moving toward a future of experiential content. That the 19th century was really about, in media, was about telling the story, and the 20th century introduced mostly showing the story, and the 21st century will be about experiencing. And that's not to say there still won't be telling and showing; those will still be important parts of it. But what will really start to change will be the idea of experiencing a story. And the question that Ellie had asked me to think about is, as the technology and delivery methods evolve, in what ways will they generate interactivity, immersion, individualization, and virtual reality participation? So I'm going to touch a bit on that. First, I would suggest there are at least two forms of interactivity. One is the interaction between or among the public, the people who tell the stories, and the second is interaction directly with the content itself. And so we're moving, in both ways toward more experiential kinds of stories, whether it's on social media like Snapchat, where people tell stories, or on Instagram or other formats where literally millions of people now are presenting their narratives for experience and interaction worldwide, and usually very rapidly on their mobiles as well. And also moving toward a future where much more of the content itself is interactive. Television, again, Ellie said, hasn't really aligned with Moore's law, and this is an area where the content hasn't progressed very far either. It's not generally a highly interactive form of content. The actual content tends still to be relatively linear and with little control that the audience has over it, but that, I think, is beginning to change. New kinds of interactive documentaries, for example. Here's one of a whole new class of interactive documentaries that are fully interactive and use different narrative models, not just a linear presentation anymore, but allow you to go through and kind of explore a story, or as a game, or in this case as a simulation based on real video footage from the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake, to let you go through there and experience it as a survivor of the earthquake, or to experience it as an aid worker, or to experience it as a journalist on assignment as a documentary maker. Or this example from a billboard in the UK that used computer vision and artificial intelligence on a low level, but still would scan the faces as they looked at the billboard, and the woman's face who'd been battered would slowly start to change each time a person looked at it, and it would give this message to not turn a blind eye toward domestic abuse. And so it started to become more of an experience and an interaction. As Ellie mentioned, we're moving toward this kind of immersive media environment, whether it's in augmented reality, where I've done a lot of work with people like Steve Feiner here at Columbia, and other people looking at ways to use this in journalism. Vice News, based in Brooklyn, New York, used before it kind of went through its whatever you want to call it, it's changed, Google Glass, to live reporting from various places like Ferguson, Missouri, during the protests, and you could walk along with the reporter. As the reporter looked around, you'd experience the story and get his kind of first-person narrative. Individualization, a lot of this being data-driven and algorithm-based and customizable. I was thinking about when Ellie mentioned, the bandwidth requirements. Well, one of the things that's interesting, if you look at gaming in particular, a lot of work where you don't have frames of video per se. Instead, you have objects that are all algorithm-driven and algorithm-generated, so that content is created on the fly in the environment where the user is. Other parts, using different kinds of algorithms and data. The surgeon scorecard got the attention of a lot of people when ProPublica produced this earlier this year, allowing you to find the most highly rated surgeons in your geographic area. And of course, surgeons didn't like the transparency of this, but it gave a lot of power to the individual to find what they were looking for. virtual reality participation. A lot of things already happening. We've already heard a bit about this. Very exciting to see the CNN live stream on the Samsung Gear VR. I happened to see one blog post that wasn't, it was very, positive post in the sense that there were people online experiencing it in 73 countries, but he also said it made him feel a little bit queasy, not just because of what they were saying, but the experience. So new types of experiences. I mentioned this kind of evolution of these three stages from telling to showing to experiencing. Journalism, moving from a model that was mostly text-based, introducing audio toward showing, using these other traditional media of mostly 20th century, and then as we move into more algorithm-driven kinds of environments where a lot of the content is built based on algorithms and allows the individual, in case of a project at the MIT Media Lab, to enter into a three-dimensional data-driven information graphic, so you can interact with the content directly and experience it in that sense, and also allowing for easy updates and continuous updates and adaptations based on the individual's situation, location, preferences. New York Times doing a lot of very interesting data-driven and algorithm-driven interactive visualizations. This one, a report from earlier this year from the Upshot, where they used data to allow you to kind of enter into a story about 1.5 million black men who are missing based on a whole variety of sociological issues and criminal justice, especially in the US. And then other applications, how the story creation process is changing. Colleagues of mine at Northwestern have developed a system that uses algorithms to write stories based on data, mostly structured data, but it's changing rapidly. Narrative science now has a lot of paying clients. If you go on Forbes.com, you'll frequently see a byline, narrative science. They're written by the algorithm. It's called the Quill. The Associated Press now is using extensively another company's product called Wordsmith. They're based out of Durham, North Carolina. The company's called Automated Insights. And a year ago, the AP could write 300 quarterly business reports. And when they introduced this system, they were able to do 3,000 without hiring any additional staff. They didn't lay off staff per se, but they were able to increase by an order of magnitude how many stories they could do because the algorithm could process the data and produce the reports. And if you read them, there would be no way, just by looking at it, to not see that it, think that it was written by a computer. The journalism, the writing style, is very consistent with the standards in business journalism today. QuakeBot. The LA Times reporter developed this system that ties directly into the U.S. Geological Survey and monitors 24 hours a day earthquake seismic activity. And if anything reaches a certain threshold, in this case, this was the first one last year, a 4.2 magnitude earthquake, QuakeBot immediately goes into the system, the USGS system, pulls out all the relevant data, instantly writes a story, and then instantly sends it to the reporter, who then quickly vets it, but the story then can be immediately put online, so that the reporting process is transformed and the storytelling process is transformed. Some of the technologies enabling this experiential media, geolocation and networking, cloud computing, the growth of wearable devices and algorithms, holography, tactile, haptic technologies, and ubiquitous sensors, that we're moving towards sort of the Internet of Everything. That's also one of the enablers. The features of the content, increasingly three-dimensional, immersive, kinetic, participation via camera, so that, Ellie said, how do you interact with that? Well, part of it is with, it looks at where your eye is focusing, but part of it also is physical movements, part of it also is voice, so there are a lot of different ways you can interact and input data. New kinds of envelopment media that envelop you in a three-dimensional kind of a three-dimensional experience, and then changing the linear structure. A lot happening in terms of sports and entertainment. There have been a lot of issues in sports and fantasy sports of late, but the emergence of kind of immersive experiences in sports media, I think we're right at the beginning of this transformation. And a lot of media organizations are already starting to experiment with this, Vice Media being one. There's a lot being done now in terms of virtual reality and sports, both for training, but also for the consumer to experience as if they're on the playing field in this arena. A company called Jaunt is developing cinematic virtual reality. So you have a narrative in which the user becomes a participant in the story as if they're present and can move through the space. And there are a number of these that are available for download and experience on a variety of platforms, not just Oculus Rift, but on my little, I have the Google Cardboard. That's the one I could afford. And so that's the one I use for this. And it's pretty compelling stuff. The one that I particularly enjoyed was the Jaunt cinematic virtual reality of Paul McCartney's concert. It's free, and it's really like you're on the stage with McCartney. And I showed it to a couple of my students, and they didn't want to give me back my cardboard. Journalism starting to use it. ABC News has experimented with this technology to do reports in Syria, looking at ways that we can tell a story about what's happening in terms of the archaeological sites in Syria and take you first person. And then extreme sports. This is another one that is available from Jaunt. Takes you along with some world-class climbers onto these extreme environments, and you're right there with them as if you're climbing that north face as well. And a lot happening with the integration of things like GoPro VR, and some of the other technologies we've already seen demonstrated or illustrated. So to conclude, I see really these two directions. One is about public engagement, and one is about experience in the storytelling. And we're seeing the public is starting to respond. New York Times now has 1 million digital-only subscribers, so people will pay for quality content or what they see as quality content. Reporters and editors and members of the public are increasingly participating in this interactive environment. Data-driven, algorithm-driven content, I think, is rapidly emerging, partly because of its ability to give you both a near view and a far view, so you can drill down and get your specific, but you can also go back out and see the context and bigger picture. A lot happening in terms of how we measure the experience. And lately there's been a lot of controversy about ad blockers on mobile platforms, and that could be a very interesting question mark as how this plays out in terms of the future, whether there'll be a tiered model. And then I would just suggest there are a lot of potential ethical questions to raise, not just legal questions, but ethical questions about these technologies and where they take us in terms of privacy, in terms of security, maybe even in terms of health. Colleagues of mine, Bob Kuby and Chicha-Mihaly, did a study some years ago about the addictive quality of television viewing. And when you think about these experiential media, the potential for them to be hugely addictive, especially for young people whose media habits are still kind of taking shape, I think could be a serious concern. So thank you.
Thank you, John. Okay, our last speaker, Evangeline.
Hi, I'm Evangeline Morphos. I teach in the School of the Arts, courses in television and new media. I began really as a theater producer, moved into film, and then television and new media. Essentially what I was doing in my career was following the writer, where the energies of the writer were going. And it clearly has been moving over the course of 50 years to television and new media. Part of it is that with television right now, we have a generation of writers who have grown up with the media. They know what it is, they have been used to it, and in effect, they are scholars of it. They know their background, just as comedy writers sort of build on other comedy writers. And I think this notion of really understanding the limits of a medium is what's important. One of the reasons that I think new media right now and different platforms are struggling with serious content is that content makers, not content providers, but content creators, are really struggling to find out what can they do in these media and what can't they do? What are the limits? What's interesting to me is to look at those works of art where an artist is struggling with the limits of their medium. Think about the film Rashomon. How do you tell a story from a number of different perspectives? And in fact, we know now that that film has created its own brand. We talk about the Rashomon effect when we think about legal studies. There's a really interesting website called Rashomon where people can crowdsource videos that they have taken of events, and they put together essentially a journalistic timeline based on people's videos. So at different points, we see artists struggling to tell a story in a way that their medium doesn't allow them to. And it's at those breakthrough moments that I think really interesting things occur. Thinking about that, a few years ago, HBO did something called the HBO Cube, which was a setup that they had in Times Square that was a huge, well, it was a cube with 4 sides to it, video cameras. As you walked around the cube, you had a different experience of what was going on in the narrative. It was called The Affair, and you never quite knew who was having an affair with whom until you actually walked around the entire way. Now, what was interactive about it for the audience was that they got to choose where they went and how they experienced the data, in what kind of order they were experiencing data. Not unlike a lot of these immersive theatrical experiences, whether it was originally Tamara or now the Macbeth thing that's happening down in Chelsea. So an issue is, how do you present a number of different sides of the story? Right now in television, we have something called The Affair on television, and you can see it from 2 sides. There's a way in which these stories are pushing the limits of their medium and are asking for different platforms, asking the story to continue in different ways. I refer you to an incredible ad done for the Honda R car. Have any of you all seen this? It's called The Other Side. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? It's an ad for a car. But what you do, you see a guy picking up his kids at school, going about his day, or, depending on whether you use the toggle switch of the R key on your computer, you can switch to the same story being told at night as a robbery heist. And it's up to you to press the R button. The deal with this is that it goes one step beyond this idea of 2 stories, 2 sides of the same story, and it requires an incredible editing job so that every moment of this progress, whether you're seeing it in the daytime view or the nighttime view, parallels with each other. Now, this notion of how a story becomes compelling depends on artistry and it depends on technique. And I think years ago, when Time magazine had you as the Man of the Year, we were expecting a lot of these things to be crowdsourced. We were expecting stories to be told by people uploading their own videos and all of that. That has proved uninteresting to the public. And I think something like the Honda R ad proves to you that you need extra artistry in order to become interesting and innovative and interactive. Now, increasingly, more and more shows are trying to stretch their medium. Steve Soderbergh is now creating a show for HBO called Mosaic, which is going to take things from a different point of view. Early on, there was a show called John from Cincinnati. that was on HBO. It was not successful, but the idea behind it was that things were happening in the television show that you could watch, but in order to fully understand part of the story, you had to go online, or you had to search YouTube for the videos that the fictional characters had posted. It was a way of extending the experience and telling the story on a number of different levels. And I think the more that content creators come of age, having grown up in a multimedia environment, we're going to begin to see more and more interesting storytelling in that form. Curiously, a sort of ordinary TV show like Hawaii Five-0 has been pressing the limits, and it was the first one on network to have an interactive ending to a story, to a murder mystery. Now, you sort of think, Hawaii Five-0, it's a reboot from the 50s, 60s. At the same time, the people who are the executive producers of it were the team that brought us the Transformer movies. And I think increasingly, as there is an interaction between people who make television, people who make films, people who are creating art entirely for the internet, we're going to find more and more interesting things happening. David Lynch, the filmmaker, is distributing his movies now entirely on the internet. Peter Greenaway, an experimental filmmaker in Britain, is working now entirely on the internet and mostly in interactive ways. And so we're beginning to see a group of content creators who are thinking about how they can stretch the limits of their storytelling and find the right bucket for the stories they want to tell. There is, too, this interaction between what the technology is doing and how the creators are using it. And some of it happens serendipitously. When the series 24 started, and I think Verizon did a mobile 1-minute series, didn't they? It was really exciting. It was called 24-Hour Conspiracy. And you could parallel what was happening in the television story once a week on your mobile. It's hard to tell a thriller in 2 minutes, but nonetheless, it was a good and brave experiment with it. But what the producers of 24 found was that a lot of their viewers and a lot of their young viewers were catching up in the series over the summer after it had aired. And a lot of those people were watching it in 24-hour blocks. What began to happen, realizing that people were going to do what they called the 24-hour marathon, is that the writing of that series changed. It became much less of a cliffhanger week to week and much more of an integrated story. Netflix, again, broke the boundaries of this when it began to release House of Cards as a 13-episode unit, and you could access it on your own time. The upside of it was that it gave audiences much more control over what they were watching. A downside is that it stopped public conversation about it. And even though House of Cards is a huge hit and doing well for Netflix, nonetheless, there doesn't seem to be that water cooler discussion. And I think that's one of the things that is going to drive a lot of the productivity of this work. Last season, there was an incredible storyline in House of Cards about sexual assault in the military. And it was happening just at the point when Congress was talking about it, when the whole world was thinking about that topic. It was hard to include House of Cards in that conversation because people were watching at their own rate. And there was no single moment where you could stop to say, watch last night's episode. Because there's now this thing about spoiler alerts, which is a real conversation dampener. So how have outlets essentially adapted to that? One thing that a number of online journalistic sources have done is to provide recaps and to provide discussions after the airing of an episode. And the sort of thrill that attaches to Game of Thrones is in large part conducted on the media through recaps and through essentially conversations on it. So this idea too, and I'll just be one more minute, of extending the conversation or extending the viewer's experience online is something that a number of networks and shows are starting to deal with.
So we've heard from different segments, really, of this industry, which is pretty interesting from the artist's perspective all the way up to distribution. We haven't heard a lot about monetization, about how Verizon is actually going to monetize this when they are creating free services. I'm kind of curious about that. We have a few minutes for a Q&A. There may be, if we have any questions in the audience. Heather, do you have a question? I think so, yes.
Hello, I'm Heather Hudson from the University of Alaska at Anchorage. That was fascinating and a little scary to my mind about some of the trends, especially John's talk about wordsmith and auto writing. I have a comment and a question. Comment is that one of you mentioned, more than 1 million digital New York Times subscribers, which I think is fascinating, but I think we're losing the sense of people even reading, younger people, reading newspapers even if they're electronic. There was a question in Sunday's Times in the magazine that they have this panel